As this is our bonus Halloween episode, of course it's going to be slightly different. Not only am I going to tell you a story entitled Christian's Coven, which was suggested by Moira Hamilton, one of our listeners, and written by my husband Peter, but you're also going to hear some real-life ghost stories from some of our fantastic listeners, Amy, Tara and Gordon, as well as hear a couple of stories from Yvonne and David from the Scottish Ghost Company. And a wee warning, you might not want to listen in the dark.
So I grew up in a place called Torry in Aberdeen. It was an old fishing village before it became sort of royal borough and part of the city, and it used to just be connected to the rest of Aberdeen by ferry. And it's a type of place where everyone's aware of the stories. You know, there was a big ferry disaster there where 32 people lost their lives, and there's the famous unsolved murder of Betty Haddon, and whenever you'd be playing on the beach next to the lighthouse, you know, you'd know that's where Betty Haddon's arm had washed up, and you sort of at a young age, you're so aware of the stories. And my particular street was, at the top of the street there was St Fichic's Church, which is a ruined church, which there was a famous ghost hunting incident in the 1980s where 2 ghost hunters sleeping overnight in the ruined church had seen a man pass, and then as the man had passed back there was only half of him and they hurt themselves running away. So it was the type of place, you know, that you were aware of that. The tenement I grew up in was just behind Craiginches, which is a notorious prison. And even in our building, we had known that in what would become my sister's bedroom before we lived there, the lady who'd lived in the flat before us had passed away in that room. We didn't know. There's lots of little stories that people would say about what had happened. We never met her, we never knew her. So that's where I was born, lived there till I was 19. And the only way I can describe it, you know, aside from Torry being this kind of place where everybody knew all these stories, it was the type of feeling that I used to have there that I've never had anywhere else I've lived, which is of not sort of being alone, like that feeling of, oh, is there someone else in here? Whereas wherever I've lived since, if no one's been home, I've known no one's been home. You come in, you feel the place is empty, but there was always a sense, I suppose, in that flat, a kind of unsettling feeling that maybe there was somebody else there. And the one incident that sticks out to me is that my younger sister, she's 3 years younger than me, she started to go through a phase of sleepwalking. And that in itself could be quite scary, I guess, when you're young, because this person is doing things and saying things, but they're not aware of them. And it used to be quite unsettling, you know, for me. But this one particular night, her room, as I say, was the room where the lady had unfortunately passed away. And this one particular night, my sister had come through. I had a single bed and just one pillow, and my sister had come through, and at first I thought she just was, you know, scared or having a nightmare. I didn't realise she was sleepwalking. So I said to her, go back to your room and get your pillow, and then you can top and tail with me. Very quickly after that, with the way she was walking, I realised it was like she understood my instructions, but I realised she was asleep. She was in her dream. So she started to walk away, and she turned back and she reached out to me. So I took her hand and I went with her. And we walked through. Her room was next to mine. But I just remember coming out of my room into the hallway, and suddenly everything felt freezing cold. And as we stood at the doorway to her room, you know, our windows would have faced the same street. We would have had the same amount of light, but there was something especially dark about her room. And I remember that, and I remember feeling scared. And all of a sudden she gasped, and she would not step forward any further. She would not go into her room. It was this loud... It was fear. She wouldn't go. So I started to step forward to say, it's okay, I'll go and get it for you, I'll go and get your pillow. And as I'm walking into the room, Hannah becomes hysterical. She's screaming. She, no, didn't want me to go into the room. She got so loud that she'd woken my dad up. And the whole time, all I could think about was how cold the room was. The room was freezing cold. Even when I picked her pillow up, it was like it had been in the fridge. It was so cold. And I came back out of the room. I never saw anything. I never felt anything other than that, just that freezing cold. And all of a sudden, my dad, when he woke up and he sort of opened his bedroom door and came out to see what was going on, it was like everything went back to normal. And when my sister woke up, she never remembered. She didn't remember a particular dream or particular nightmare. So it's me that was stuck with that memory. So we will never know, I suppose, what she saw. I didn't see it, but I felt it. It was like something where she was sleepwalking. that she could see something that I perhaps couldn't, but I was aware was there. Nothing ever happened after that. There were a few strange incidences that I would think, how did that... My TV in my bedroom used to come on an awful lot, and just again, sometimes that you came home and you just had this feeling people were there and then no one was there. There were incidents like that. It was almost like if there was something there, it visited my sister that night and never again. Occasionally maybe made its presence known. But all I know is since leaving, I've never experienced that feeling again. If nobody is in my home currently, I know nobody is in. I've never felt the sense of not being alone. So I guess make of that what you will.
After hearing this story, I asked Tara if the lady who had lived in the flat before Tara and her family had been murdered or died violently in the flat. And Tara said the story was the lady who lived there previously had died accidentally after drinking heavily. Thank you so much, Tara, for telling us this really creepy story. The next spooky story is from David and Yvonne from the Scottish Ghost Company.
Hi, it's Yvonne and David from the Scottish Ghost Company, and this is a wee story about one of our scariest moments or evenings at Jedburgh Castle Jail in Jedburgh.
So just a bit of background history on Jedburgh Castle Jail. Jedburgh Castle Jail is built on the site of the original Jedburgh Castle, which the Scottish demolished purely because of the constant border wars between Scotland and England, and the people of Jedburgh decided they would rather not have a castle at all than have the English conquer it.
So on this particular night we were in Jedburgh, we had about 8 guests, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
All in different cells. We had popped them all into a cell of their own, and David and I stood out in the hall. So to put you in a picture, it was pitch black, as in that horrible deafening black, you couldn't see in front of you. Everyone was all in their cells, and David had asked spirits to come forward and, give a sign that they're with us in one of the cell blocks. Maybe to touch one of them or bang one of the doors or something. And as I say, it was so dark you couldn't even see your hands in front of you, but I was really aware that David was to my right hand side. So suddenly I got this, like a cold breeze just on my face, but I genuinely thought at the time that it was coming, it was just drafty, it was just an old cell block and it was just drafty. And I heard David saying, "Could you stand back a bit, please?" And at this point I thought he was talking to me, so I moved to the left a little bit, thinking maybe I was just too close to him. And again he said, "I've already asked you, can you step back, please? I'm not going to ask you again," but he was quite, cheeky with it. So again, I went as near to the wall as I possibly could. So this carried on for a wee while. David had said a couple of times after that about standing back. And at the end of the night, David said to me, "How are you? You okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And he said, "What were you experiencing up there?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "I just got a horrible feeling." I said, "And I had this cold breeze constantly right in at my face." And he said, "Yeah, I had already asked him to stand back." And I said, "I thought you were talking to me." And he said, "No, I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to the jailer, or the warden, the warden.
Who took a shine to you?
Who'd taken a wee shine to me and was apparently right in my face." Now that creeped me out, to be quite honest, but I think you said he was just getting just a little bit too close.
Yeah. So when I had turned round to look at you, I saw the jailer, who was really angry and irate, shouting right in your face, and that was why I kept telling him to stand back, because I thought he was going to do you damage.
So later on that evening I was down in the base room because one of the guests had taken not well. We all carry radios, and all of a sudden David comes through the door with another 2 guests and said he'd been trying to radio me. My radio didn't go off, I didn't hear any messages, and he brought down another 2 guests. So by this time I had 3 guests that were all affected by something in the cell block that we were in. Managed to sit all them down, and they started to feel a bit better once they'd actually come out the cell block. And then one of our crew members took not well, just the same feeling, just not feeling well and just a bit frightened, and had to come down. And there was 4 at the one time down in the base room, which is It's quite unusual. You
Very
sometimes
unusual, yeah.
get one guest, but not four altogether. So Jedburgh is definitely a spooky place.
Well, that was because that particular cell block is the men's block, which is so notoriously haunted it's closed to the public for daytime tours and things. I had already told everybody to be on their guard because there was a semi-demonic entity in there, and it was the reason why people were being attacked, essentially, and feeling really ill and having to come out and come well out of the building until their energies could be restored back to themselves. That night, after the fourth victim, or the fifth victim, I can't remember exactly how many it was, I closed that cell block off, so we stopped using that for the rest of the night purely because I personally was scared for people's health.
Safety, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If this story gave you chills, then why not check out the ghost hunts that the Scottish Ghost Company organise to experience your own ghostly chills? There will be more spooky stories from Yvonne and David later, but for now, here's the story of Christian's Coven. In the early 1700s, the daughter of the Laird of Bargarran, Christian Shaw, was a Scottish industrialist and was widely regarded as being the founder of the thread industry in Renfrewshire in Scotland. This was after Christine travelled to the Netherlands and observed the spinning techniques there, along with seemingly smuggling some of the necessary equipment back to Scotland in her luggage. This allowed for the spinning of a more durable and whiter yarn of thread known as Bargarran thread back home in Renfrewshire. However, it would be the spinning a yarn of a different kind as a child in the late 1600s that would also carry the Bargarran name, but in a far darker and shocking way. The late 1600s were just a decade or so before those beginnings of the Renfrewshire thread industry, but would seem like centuries before in comparison, where fears were more primitive and the people persuaded more easily. In 1696, it would be in Paisley in Renfrewshire, where a young 11-year-old Christian Shaw would become part of a thread of events which would shock then and echo through the centuries to now. Christian, as the daughter of John Shaw, who was the Laird of Bargarran, led a relatively privileged life living in Bargarran House. This included her father and landowner keeping servants. And one day, Christian saw one of the servants, Catherine Campbell, stealing a drink of milk, and so she reported this to her mother. When the servant, Catherine, discovered what Christian had done, she cursed the young girl by wishing that the devil would haul her soul through hell. This could easily be dismissed as an offhand remark delivered in anger if this had been, in the later industrial age of Renfrewshire, that the older Christian herself would help start, but this was a very different Renfrewshire of Christian's more sensitive youth. It would be a few days later when Christian Shaw encountered Agnes Naismith, an elderly woman described as being addicted to threatenings, who lived alone and was known for speaking her mind, and she inquired how Christian was feeling, to which Christian replied she was feeling fine. However, the day after the encounter with Agnes asking about her health, and a few days on from the curse from the servant Catherine, Christian fell ill. She began to have seizures, at times was unable to see or hear, and her body would extend or contract violently. She was clearly no longer feeling fine. However, as her illness progressed, so did the nature of her symptoms, which went from those not unlikely of a serious illness to others which included apparently spitting out feathers, her own hair, carcasses of small animals, and even something that wouldn't seem out of place in her later life, pins. Whatever was really happening, Christian's parents would have been rightly concerned for their daughter, but they believed that she was cursed. This was seemingly confirmed in their eyes when for a short period Christian recovered and told her parents she could see the family's servant, Catherine, who had stolen the drink of milk, and the old woman Agnes, of whom people at the time would have accused of being a witch, stabbing at her sides and threatening to cut her open. It would be 2 months before Christian Shaw's parents, concerned for their young daughter's health, would head the 11 miles or 18 kilometres to Glasgow to see the skilled physician Dr. Matthew Brisbane. You would assume that a visit to the more rational doctor would help find out the true cause of Christian's poor health. but instead it was stated that while in his surgery, Christian spat out a coal cinder as large as a chestnut and almost too hot for Dr. Brisbane to handle, which caused the doctor to state that her symptoms were beyond what is normal or natural. Many other fantastical symptoms exhibited by Christian included citing scriptures and concepts beyond her years, seeming to fly unaided across her classroom, and picking up a glove without using her hands. She would even at times plead with her unseen Catherine Campbell to resume their friendship, which had ended due to her reporting the theft of the drink of milk to her mother. A week after Christian and her parents had visited the doctor in Glasgow, which had produced no true explanation for their daughter's affliction, Christian did recover, albeit briefly, before her fits returned, but this time more violent than before. Still left with no answers as to what was happening to Christian, her parents turned to their local parish minister, who stated that the young Christian was possessed and was being tormented by witches, something that was unfortunately quite commonly thought of at the time, and many of her symptoms matched those from the Salem witch trials a few years earlier in America. And interestingly enough, America had recently been visited by Christian's father, John Shaw, the Laird of Bargarin. The church set up weekly fast and prayer meetings at Bargarin House, and Christian Shaw's father appealed to the authorities that those named by his daughter should be arrested. Although it was overlooked at the time, Agnes Naismith, the elderly woman Christian had encountered and who had asked about her health, appeared to genuinely be concerned about Christian, and she visited her at Bargarin House, where she prayed for her and wished her a speedy recovery. Although Catherine Campbell seemingly stated, according to John Miller's account, recorded in his collection The Witches of Renfrewshire, that the devil never let Christian grow better. Although only 2 people were initially named by Christian, which included the servant and the old woman she encountered, the list of the accused grew to include 20 women, 10 men, and 5 other men or women as being part of a coven of witches that Christian blamed for her possession. The Scottish Privy Council set up a commission to investigate the events surrounding Christian Shaw at the request of the church in Paisley to see if there was a case against those accused, and 7 of those names, which included Catherine Campbell and Agnes Naismith, along with Margaret Lang, John Lindsay, James Lindsay, John Reed and Margaret Fulton, were summoned for trial and appeared at a second commission in Paisley charged with murder and tormenting a number of people, including Christian Shaw. The others did not face trial, as their relatives were seemingly able to use their standing in society to buy them out of what became known as the Renfrewshire witch trials, by offering what lands and goods they could. However, that was not possible for the other 7, which included John and James Lindsay, who were only 11 and 14 at the time. The advocate for the 7 who stood trial argued that the prosecution was obliged to rule out the possibility that the events could be explained by natural causes, but Dr. Matthew Brisbane gave evidence that he could not find any such cause for Christian Shaw's condition. There were also seemingly witches' marks found on the bodies of the accused, and doubt was cast on any reasonable explanations for those marks, which were offered by other physicians. The prosecutor confronted the jury, saying if the defendants were acquitted, then those on the jury would be accessories to all the blasphemies, atrocities, murders, tortures, and seductions, going on to say that those enemies of heaven and earth shall hereafter be guilty when they get out. This gave the jurors little choice but to find all 7 of those accused guilty, based upon the word of 11-year-old Christian Shaw. After the guilty verdict was delivered, James Reed decided his own fate by taking his own life in prison, but the other 3 men and 3 women were to be strangled and burnt on the Gallow Green in Paisley in June 1697, in front of a large and boisterous crowd. This included Catherine Campbell, who was carried struggling and screaming to the gallows, and calling down the wrath of God and the devil on her accusers, and Agnes Naismith, who seemingly laid a dying woman's curse on everyone present and their descendants, where for many years afterwards every tragedy in the town was blamed on this witch's curse. However, the deaths of those who would become known as the Bargarin witches would be the last mass execution for witchcraft in Western Europe. The remains of the dead were buried at a crossing known today as Maxwelton Cross, and a horseshoe was placed on top of their buried remains, which went missing a few years later. In 2008, this was replaced with a bronze plaque featuring a stainless steel horseshoe and the inscription, "Pain inflicted, suffering endured, injustice done," in a tribute to make sure people never forget the true tragedy of those who had suffered and died based merely on a yarn spun by a young girl who would of course live to grow up and spin those yarns of a different kind.
Hi, it's Yvonne and David from the Scottish Ghost Company. So we decided to go out one Saturday night and we were investigating an abandoned building in Ayrshire, and this building was dilapidated basement.
It's just a shell, yeah.
We were in the basement area. There was a kind of stone vaulted cellar roof above us, and that was about it. Above that was nothing at all.
No
There's
floors,
no floors, no
doors,
nothing.
no windows.
So we were standing calling out to say in the middle of nowhere. It takes you about 10 minutes to walk from the car, and we were standing calling out, and all of a sudden right above my head I heard footsteps walking right above and right across, and you hear me on the audio saying to David, "Did you hear those footsteps?" And it wasn't until we got back to the car, and we usually listen to the stuff on the way home, that clear as anything you can hear footsteps walking across what sounds like a wooden floor above us. There was no wooden floor above us.
There isn't any wooden floors left at all.
And you hear the footsteps obviously loud right above us, getting, quieter as they go along, and then you hear a man's cough at the very end of the corridor.
Yeah, but he was walking. On the recording, you can hear it's somebody walking with a purpose. It's not somebody just milling about.
No.
He was walking purposely from one side of the room to the other.
We then moved into the kitchen area, what would have been the kitchen area of that castle, and we had a luminous ball set up with some torches. Now, the ball rolled, which again can be seen on the video, and although we didn't hear anything at the time, again we listened back, and as clear as anything you can hear a lady saying, "Here, Carrie."
Yeah, that's right.
It wasn't me.
Yeah.
So we think it was maybe one of the kitchen staff shouting on the kitchen cat, but you can hear it on our TikTok video.
But the interesting thing is, kitchen cats were a thing way back then because they were supposed to control the mice from eating the food and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It was amazing.
Our next story is from Gordon, who got in touch after listening to our episode about the murder of Tommy Guyon in Aberdeen in 1963. Gordon used to live in the same street where the murder took place, and he feels, although he is slightly sceptical, that he was visited either by Tommy Guyon or his murderer, Henry Burnett, who was later hanged for his crime.
Henry killed Tommy in Jackson Terrace in Aberdeen. I used to live in Jackson Terrace, number 1, in Aberdeen, with a flatmate. However, he worked offshore, so I lived alone for the majority of the time. One August, I woke in the middle of the night to find a man standing in my bedroom at the door. I assumed or thought it was a burglar or something, so jumped out of bed and ran at him, and as I ran at him, he disappeared into a puff of smoke. It's fair to say I was fairly freaked out and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The man had scruffy hair, an untidy beard, was wearing a jumper with horizontal grey and black stripes with dark trousers. Nothing happened for the remainder of the month. However, the following August, again I woke in the middle of the night. I woke to find the same figure standing on the right hand side of my bed, looking at me. As I began to move, he pointed over my shoulder, and I looked over to see what he was pointing at, and as I rolled over, my alarm clock went off. He disappeared, and I got up and went to work, although fairly freaked out. Nothing happened for the remainder of the month. However, the following August, again, I woke up at some point in the night to find this person standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me silently, unmoving. Again, I jumped out of bed, assuming it was here for nefarious reasons, and as I approached him, he disappeared into a puff of smoke. Yet again, I was freaked out. I don't think I slept again that night, and it was at this point I decided to speak to my flatmate to see if he had experienced anything. He said he hadn't. However, he must have gone away and done a little bit of research, and he came back and told me about the Tommy Guyan and Henry Barnett murders. I was aware that Henry Barnett was hung in August, and we are of the opinion that Henry comes back every August for whatever nefarious reasons and haunts Jackson Terrace.
Again, David and I were away investigating somewhere down near the borders. It was a hotel down at the borders who were having some poltergeist activity. We had went in to investigate it. Now, we were the only ones, apart from the other crew, that were staying at a different part of the hotel on a different floor. So we were the only ones staying in this room down this end of the hotel. David and I were sharing a room, and David was asleep, and the hall light was on in the hotel corridor, and I turned round and could see what I thought was, it looked like 2 feet under it was an old hotel, under the crack of the door. So thinking it was one of the crew having a laugh and had come along, I just kind of watched it for a wee minute, and it disappeared, and then it came back again, and then I realised, no, it wasn't any crew, it was just us that was down that end.
It was a ghost.
And I got up and got my fleece and I flung it in front of the crack in the door, and I don't think I slept a wink, to be quite honest, because all I heard all night was footsteps, noises, creaks, and then when we checked in the morning, no one had come down our end. And anyway, even if they had, we would have heard the fire door opening, but didn't hear any of that.
But it was such a long corridor. We were in a completely different wing to everybody else. There was nobody there.
So that scared me. That was one of the kind of scariest nights in that hotel.
Our final spooky story will be from Amy, who recently appeared on the BBC's The Big Scottish Book Club Crime Special, along with me, Nancy from CrimeCon, and Alistair from Scott's Way Hey podcast. You can watch this now on iPlayer if you're in the UK. And I first met Amy at CrimeCon in Glasgow. Speaking of which, are you planning on coming along to CrimeCon in Glasgow in April 2024 and CrimeCon in London in September 2024? If so, then don't forget to claim your discount by using the code SCOTTISH at the checkout. So without further ado, here's Amy's story.
I was around 8 or 9, this would have been about 2003 to 2004. I was on holiday with my parents. I think we were either in Cyprus or Portugal. It was late at night and we were having dinner in a restaurant, and I got up to the toilet, and back then I was a very shy kid, so I was afraid to ask for directions. I thought I would just wing it, find the toilet myself. I ended up in this very dark, sort of very dim warehouse kind of room. It was completely silent. I just remember the silence because I had just come from this really loud restaurant, which, is full of restaurant noises and people. And then suddenly I'd stepped through this door and there was just absolutely nothing at all. There was just silence. I remember at the time likening it to going through the wardrobe in Narnia, but instead of going into bright snow, I had just stepped into this completely dark, silent room, and it was very creepy. There was a staircase in the corner of the room, and it was going up, and there was a door in the landing, which I could kind of make out, but the rest of the staircase was in complete darkness, and I couldn't see where it went. I was really into Goosebumps at the time and also Most Haunted, so I thought I'd have my own adventure and do a bit of exploring in that sort of style. I noticed near the bottom of the steps that there was the outline of a woman. To this day, I still remember it like it was yesterday. The best way that I can describe her is that she was like a shadow, so I could see the shape of her, but I couldn't actually see any defining features. I do remember though that it looked like she had a Victorian dress on, and I remember that because we were actually studying the Victorians at school at the time, so that's why it sticks in my mind. The first time I saw this, I thought it was my own shadow coming through the windows, but the shape of it didn't match because I didn't have a dress on. I didn't like dresses. So, but you know what, I thought, I'm going to investigate this anyway and see what this is. So, I remember walking towards the steps, and this shadow thing was, I can only describe it as moving or sort of floating up the stairs. It was really weird to see. And every time I took a step further, the shadow sort of floated slightly up as if it wanted me to follow it. I took a few steps and I ended up at the door on the landing. I remember opening it, and it sort of, you took a few more steps and you sort of looked out to the street below. I was terrified of heights, I still am, so I was like, no, not for me. Came back in, closed the door, and I remember looking up, so I could sort of see a little bit of the stairs going up. I couldn't see again because it was kind of dark, but I remember the shadow was continuing to go up these stairs. And I thought, I'll follow it, see what's going on. So I followed it for a few more steps. And then suddenly, to this day, I have never experienced anything like this. I don't know how to describe it, but I just suddenly had this horrible, dark feeling come over me. It was like a sense of like foreboding. Like if I followed this thing, something really, really bad would happen. And I just remember being like, this is, whoa. Like, and the feeling of it was very, very strong. I remember having to hold on to the sort of like side panel thing because the feeling was so strong. And also, I couldn't see where the rest of the stairs went, which just really, really freaked me out. And I do remember seeing the shadow stop and sort of float in midair whenever I stopped moving. So like if I was to stop following it, it would just suddenly stop moving as well and it would just float. To be honest, at this point I was absolutely terrified and I was like, I want to get out of here. I sprinted down the stairs as fast as I could. I remember reaching the bottom of the stairs and I remember looking back and the shadow thing was sort of slowly floating down the stairs towards me. So I sprinted to the door, which I'd come through, and I remember I looked back one last time because I thought, I want to remember this. I remember thinking to myself, I'm probably like imagining it, I want to have another look just to make sure I'm not going crazy. And the shadow was at the top of the stairs and I watched it sort of float back up towards the darkness. I couldn't see anything of it. It sort of went upstairs and just disappeared. And I was just freaked at this point, so I ran back to the table where my parents were. They didn't seem concerned or worried about me, and they just kind of assumed that I had been playing with other kids in the restaurant. I have to say, to this day, I have never told them about what I saw. I remember this because back then my parents were pretty strict and they wouldn't really let me wander off for too long, If I was gone for like longer than 5 minutes, they would come find me and drag me back. So I remember thinking, if I tell them what's happened, they'll probably not let me go off and play for the rest of the holidays. I thought, I'm going to just keep quiet about this. And I also remember thinking, if I tell them, they will think that my imagination has gone wild and will stop me from watching Most Haunted and Goosebumps, and I think it was Are You Afraid of the Dark as well, which I was into at the time. So I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to say anything to them because they might stop me from watching these and I don't want that to happen. But honestly, to this day, I can't explain what I saw. I don't know what that shadow thing was. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted. It freaks me out to think what could have happened if I'd followed it all the way up those stairs. I really don't know what it was. I wish I could explain it. Sometimes I wonder if I've imagined it. Maybe I was just really tired. Maybe the heat had gotten to me and I was really tired, but I know what I saw. I specifically remember these things and seeing these things and feeling that sense of foreboding. I just remember that feeling of absolute dread coming over me, and I just remember being absolutely terrified. Yeah, it's been 20 years and it still affects me to this day. I don't know what that thing wanted with me, but it wanted something.
And that's the end. Thank you so much to Tara, Gordon, Amy and Yvonne and David from the Scottish Ghost Company. We hope you enjoyed our spooky Halloween stories.
Scottish Murders is a production of Fairies.